Okay, well, I'm not going to go over the regions in depth, but I do want to highlight a few things about the European regions. And first off, let's take a look at this kind of little line here. We mentioned in the introduction, this is what's called the European core. And this is where the bulk of the population of Europe lives. So you can see within this kind of darker shading along the same pattern where you see that line. And this is where most of the economic activity is as well. And most of the Western Europe here, this region, United Kingdom, Ireland, Germany, France, and others, make up the bulk of the European core. And Northern Europe is going to be, part of it's going to be in the core, and part of it's going to be what we call the periphery, the outside of the core, especially in these cold, high latitude places, and we had at sea in Iceland. Mediterranean and Southern Europe are going to be likewise, part of it is going to be kind of the well-connected parts on the inside, less well-connected on the outside. And then similar in Eastern Europe, part of Poland maybe is part of the core, and then it gets a little less as you get further out. Okay. Talk a little bit about Western Europe. The big, Germany is the big country here with the largest population in Europe, over 80 million people, whereas the next ones have like 50-something million people. It's also the largest economy in the world, and it varies, but they're around 4th or 5th largest economy in the world. So Germany is a major player in the world economic stage, biggest country in Western Europe. A couple of other things I'll highlight is the Benelux countries. That stands for Belgium, Netherlands, and little Luxembourg here. And collectively, they're known as the low Benelux countries. These are countries that used to be, quite swampy. They've been kind of built out of like marshy lowlands, and have really an area of high population density now. France, one thing I'll note about France is France has what's called a primate city. If you look at cities by their size in Western Europe, Germany is a collection of kind of middle to large cities, middle-sized cities, where France has a lot of tiny ones and one big one. If I asked you what's the biggest city in France, Paris would probably be an easy answer. If I asked you the second and third biggest city in France, I wouldn't probably have a good answer either. And that's kind of the point. Paris is a big, massive city. Same in United Kingdom, they have London, but after that, it kind of really drops off. In some places, you have a conurbation, which is, think of the Bay Area or Los Angeles, where you have one city after the other. These are common in Western Europe as well. One example is something called the Randstad, which means ring city, because it's a ring of cities around an agricultural area here in the Netherlands. You have the big cities, Amsterdam, but you also have Rotterdam, which is a big port city. You have The Hague, which is where the World Court is. You have a major university city, but they're all kind of connected together in a big ring. This is called the Randstad in Netherlands. It's a good example of a large conurbation. One thing to note about Germany, until relatively recently, from the end of World War II, during the Cold War period till 1990, Germany was divided into two parts. Eastern Germany, which is under the influence of the Soviet Union, and Western Germany, which was more part of NATO and Western Europe. And they both developed differently economically. That the East tend to be, kind of backward and poor because they had a communist economy, whereas the West was more well-connected in the world and had a higher economy. But these were reunited in 1990. In some instances, the eastern part is still kind of catching up economically. If you look at how much, the income levels, Eastern Europe tends to trail behind those in Western Germany. But in a sense, they're kind of catching up over time. This is showing Britain and Ireland. You have the United Kingdom. And just a little explainer here. We use these terms: Britain, British Isles, United Kingdom. Okay, so Ireland, and this is called Great Britain. Great Britain is this island. Ireland is this island. Together, they're the British Isles, right? And at one time, you had a kingdom of Great Britain, and they also, controlled Ireland too. But when part of Ireland became independent, the name was changed to include the United Kingdom of England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. And it's all confusing, but we might say England, might say the British, Great Britain, might use the country name of United Kingdom, but all in all, we're kind of describing generally the same places. Basically, you have the British or United Kingdom dominated by England, and then you have Ireland, which is an independent country with a bit of it part of this United Kingdom. A little bit about the economic geography. If you look at these two figures, from Scotland over and off of Norway, you see a lot of these kind of lines, which are pipelines. And this is in the North Sea. The North Sea off of Norway, and especially benefiting Norway, has a lot of oil and gas resources. Not as much as the Middle East or United States, but a significant amount. It's a significant amount contributor to a lot of the economic activity in Norway. A lot of it is owned by the government itself. It helps to support many of their government programs for people. So Norway is probably the one that really benefits the most from oil in the North Sea. I'm just kind of looking at Portugal, or actually let's just look at Spain here. This is showing that where we have that core area versus the periphery. So the idea is that within the core, like in Catalonia, Aragon, you'll have more connectivity with the rest of Europe, more economic activity. And when you get down here to Andalusia, it's more country. You know what I mean? You're getting out to the sticks. It's kind of like, think of this is the Bay Area and this is the San Joaquin Valley. You kind of make an analog. This might be Bakersfield down here, and this is like San Jose. So you have that kind of core where you have the well-connected part of California, and kind of the peripheral, like the San Joaquin Valley. Now, similar dynamics occur in Spain and also in Italy too. You have kind of more connected, more industrial parts in the north, more country, more rural parts in the south. And this is Eastern Europe, but we're going to talk more about Russia and the Soviet Union first, and we're going to circle back and come back and talk more about the Eastern Europe. But one thing it's showing you here is different ethnic minorities. And so in Ukraine and Belarus, one thing they have is they have large patches of Russian minorities. And same thing in Latvia and some of these other parts. And this is kind of a relic of both the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, of people moving ethnic people out and moving Russian people in. And that's still something that persists today. And a lot of Eastern Europe was behind what was called the Iron Curtain. And the Iron Curtain, the idea is that that's sort of the places that were under the influence of the Soviet Union during that Cold War era. We're going to circle back and talk more about the Iron Curtain and the Cold War after we talk a little. We're going to jump ahead to Russia, because you can't really talk about Eastern Europe and the Cold War without a little bit of understanding of Russia, the Soviet Union, because some of these countries used to be part of the Soviet Union. So let's talk about Soviet Union. We'll circle back and talk about Eastern Europe.